Hello guys, welcome to Infinite Stories. Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Let's get into the story. Kennedy was always the life of the party, effortlessly charming yet selective in who caught his attention. One fateful evening during a college gala, he spotted her, Precious. Her shimmering red dress hugged her figure, accentuating her every move as she laughed with friends. She seemed almost untouchable, radiating an aura of confidence and mystery that Kennedy couldn't resist. Mustering his courage, he approached her, and their conversation began awkwardly before blossoming into an engaging exchange. Precious, with her infectious laugh and sharp wit, had Kennedy hanging on her every word. By the end of the night, Kennedy felt something unfamiliar, a deep pull toward her that he hadn't felt before. He couldn't stop thinking about her after they exchanged numbers, dreaming of where this connection might lead. Over the following weeks, their relationship grew. They shared long walks through the park, late-night phone calls, and spontaneous dinners that left Kennedy more enchanted with her. But there was a quiet, calculated glimmer in Precious's eyes that Kennedy often overlooked. She spoke fondly of her admiration for successful men and their lavish lifestyles, though Kennedy dismissed it as playful banter. To him, Precious was perfect, an embodiment of grace and ambition. Little did he know, this budding romance would ignite a series of events that would shatter his perception of love and loyalty forever. Eager to solidify their growing connection, Kennedy decided it was time to introduce Precious to his father, Richard. Richard was a self-made billionaire, known for his commanding presence, sharp mind, and undeniable charisma. Kennedy admired his father deeply but felt a subtle distance between them, a gap created by years of Richard prioritizing business over family. Nevertheless, Kennedy was excited for Precious to meet the man he idolized. On the evening of their dinner, Richard greeted them warmly, his keen eyes instantly assessing Precious with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Precious, on the other hand, was taken aback by Richard's presence. His tailored suit, salt and pepper hair, and air of authority made him irresistible in a way Kennedy hadn't anticipated. As the dinner progressed, the conversations flowed naturally. Precious charmed Richard effortlessly, laughing at his anecdotes and engaging him in deep discussions about his business ventures. Kennedy, proud of the easy rapport between his girlfriend and father, failed to notice the lingering glances Richard exchanged with Precious or the subtle way she leaned in when speaking to him. By the end of the night, Richard was undeniably intrigued by Precious, and she, in turn, felt drawn to the allure of his wealth and power. Kennedy, oblivious to the brewing storm, left the dinner feeling optimistic, believing his father's approval was a sign that Precious belonged in his life. The dinner had left an impression on Richard, though not in the way Kennedy imagined. For years, Richard had focused solely on his business empire, dismissing any chance of romance after his wife's passing. But Precious was different, young, beautiful, and captivating in a way that stirred something dormant within him. In the days following the dinner, Richard found his thoughts drifting to her smile, her laughter, and the spark in her eyes when she spoke. He rationalized his interest as harmless admiration, but deep down, he felt something stronger. Meanwhile, Kennedy remained blissfully unaware of his father's growing fascination. Precious, however, was far more perceptive. She noticed the subtle signs, the extra warmth in Richard's tone, the compliments he slipped into conversations. Her mind began to race. As much as she enjoyed Kennedy's company, the prospect of being with someone as powerful and wealthy as Richard was tantalizing. Precious began to flirt with the idea, testing boundaries with coy remarks and lingering smiles. What started as subtle intrigue soon began to morph into something dangerous, a spark that neither Richard nor Precious could ignore. Kennedy couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Precious had been distracted lately, her usual enthusiasm dimmed. When they were together, she seemed preoccupied, often checking her phone or lost in thought. At first, Kennedy brushed it off as stress from her studies, but the doubts crept in slowly, gnawing at his mind. He decided to confront her one evening, asking if everything was okay. Precious, quick on her feet, reassured him with a dazzling smile and a few sweet words. "You're overthinking," she said, kissing his cheek. "Everything's fine." But not everything was fine. Behind Kennedy's back, Precious and Richard had started exchanging texts. It began innocently, questions about work, casual compliments, but the tone shifted with each message. Richard found himself looking forward to her replies, while Precious became increasingly bold in her responses. Their conversations danced around unspoken truths, each pretending there was no harm in their growing connection. Kennedy's suspicions lingered, but he trusted Precious too much to believe she'd betray him. Richard decided to test the waters further. He invited Precious to lunch under the guise of discussing a potential internship at his company. When she arrived, Richard spared no expense, choosing a luxurious rooftop restaurant that showcased the city's skyline. Precious arrived wearing a form-fitting black dress that left Richard momentarily speechless. Over wine and laughter, the two grew closer, their conversations laced with flirtation. Precious was strategic, complimenting Richard in ways that made him feel younger and more vibrant, while he lavished her with praise for her intelligence and beauty. By the end of the meal, it was clear they'd crossed a line. As Richard walked Precious to her car, the tension between them was palpable. He hesitated before leaning in closer, his hand brushing hers. "You're truly remarkable," he said softly, his voice betraying the emotions he struggled to contain. Precious smiled, tilting her head as if inviting him to say more. It was a moment that cemented the dangerous connection between them, a connection neither was ready to admit out loud. Kennedy noticed a shift in Precious after her lunch with his father. She seemed colder, her once frequent displays of affection now sporadic. Kennedy tried to salvage their relationship, planning romantic dates and showering her with gifts, but Precious remained distant. One evening, as they sat in his apartment, he asked her directly, "Do you still love me?" The vulnerability in his voice startled Precious, but she recovered quickly. "Of course I do," she lied, leaning in to kiss him. But her kiss felt hollow, and Kennedy sensed the walls between them growing thicker. Richard, on the other hand, struggled with guilt. He knew his feelings for Precious were inappropriate, yet he couldn't stop himself. Late at night, he found himself replaying their conversations, her laughter echoing in his mind. He considered confessing to Kennedy, but the fear of losing his son held him back. Precious, meanwhile, found herself at a crossroads. She enjoyed Kennedy's youthful energy but couldn't ignore the allure of Richard's wealth and power. Torn between the two, she began to distance herself from Kennedy, setting the stage for the inevitable fallout. The truth came out one evening when Kennedy stumbled upon Precious and Richard in an intimate conversation at the family estate. Kennedy had arrived unannounced, hoping to surprise Precious, but instead, he found them laughing together on the patio, their connection undeniable. Frozen in place, Kennedy felt a surge of betrayal and rage. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. Precious and Richard exchanged a panicked glance, their silence confirming Kennedy's worst fears. Kennedy erupted, hurling accusations at both of them. "How could you do this to me?" he yelled, his voice cracking. Richard tried to explain, stumbling over his words, but Kennedy was too hurt to listen. Precious, caught off guard, struggled to justify herself. "It's not what it looks like," she began, but Kennedy cut her off. "Don't lie to me," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. In that moment, the bond between father and son fractured irreparably, leaving Kennedy devastated and furious. After the confrontation, Precious realized she had to make a choice. As much as she cared for Kennedy, her ambition and attraction to Richard's lifestyle outweighed her feelings. One evening, she met Richard at a private lounge to discuss their future. "I can't keep doing this," Precious confessed, her voice trembling. Richard, equally torn, reached for her hand. "I know this isn't easy," he said. "But I can't deny how I feel about you." They sat in silence for a moment, their unspoken emotions hanging heavy in the air. Precious ultimately decided to be with Richard, seduced by his wealth and charm. She knew the decision would destroy Kennedy, but she convinced herself it was for the best. Richard, too, struggled with guilt but couldn't resist the pull he felt toward her. Together, they made plans to go public with their relationship, knowing full well the chaos it would unleash. Richard broke the news to Kennedy in the most devastating way possible, a family dinner. As they sat at the table, Richard cleared his throat. "I have something to share," he began, his tone solemn. Kennedy looked up, his heart sinking as he saw Precious sitting beside his father, her hand resting on his. "Precious and I are together," Richard announced, his words cutting through the air like a knife. Kennedy's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You're joking, right?" he spat, his voice rising. But Richard remained firm, his expression serious. Precious avoided Kennedy's gaze, her guilt evident. Kennedy exploded, slamming his fists on the table. "You betrayed me," he shouted, storming out of the room. For Kennedy, the betrayal wasn't just about losing Precious, it was about losing trust in his father, the one person he'd always looked up to. Kennedy moved out of the family home, unable to face Richard or Precious. He spiraled into a deep depression, haunted by memories of his relationship with Precious and the betrayal he felt. Nights were the worst, as he replayed their happiest moments in his mind, only to be jolted back to the harsh reality of her betrayal. Friends tried to reach out, but Kennedy pushed them away, isolating himself in his pain. Meanwhile, Richard and Precious tried to move forward with their relationship, but the shadow of Kennedy's heartbreak loomed over them. Richard struggled with his decision, questioning whether he had made a mistake. Precious, though enjoying the perks of her new lifestyle, couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. Their relationship, though passionate, was fraught with tension and regret. The fractures in their bond hinted at the storm brewing on the horizon, one that would test them both in ways they hadn't anticipated. The scandal of Richard and Precious's relationship spread quickly within their social circles. Wealthy elites, business associates, and even casual acquaintances whispered about the audacity of Richard dating his son's girlfriend. Tabloids caught wind of the drama, painting Richard as a selfish older man stealing his son's love interest. Precious, though thrilled by the attention, found herself the target of online trolls who labeled her a gold digger. Kennedy, now living alone, avoided the media frenzy, but he couldn't escape the whispers that seemed to follow him everywhere. He drowned his sorrows in work and alcohol, using the chaos to fuel his resentment. The betrayal became a public spectacle, and every headline, every whisper, was another dagger to his heart. Richard, trying to protect Precious from the backlash, hired a PR firm to spin the narrative, framing their relationship as a story of unexpected love. However, the damage was done. Consumed by bitterness, Kennedy vowed to make them pay for what they had done. He began digging into Precious's past, hiring a private investigator to uncover any secrets he could use against her. To his surprise, he discovered a trail of failed relationships with older, wealthy men who had all fallen victim to Precious's charms. Kennedy saw this as his chance to expose her true nature. Simultaneously, Kennedy started leaking subtle rumors about his father's questionable choices in the company. He knew it was a dangerous game, but the thought of watching Richard and Precious's perfect image crumble gave him a grim sense of satisfaction. For Kennedy, revenge wasn't just about payback, it was about reclaiming control in a world that had turned its back on him. Precious started to notice the strain in her relationship with Richard. While he showered her with gifts and attention, his work often pulled him away, leaving her feeling lonely and unfulfilled. She had traded Kennedy's youthful energy for Richard's stability, but she hadn't anticipated the emptiness that came with it. Richard, too, began to feel the weight of their relationship. His once unshakable confidence was eroded by the constant judgment from others. He noticed the way Precious's eyes lingered on younger men at parties, and doubt began to creep into his mind. Could Precious truly love him, or was he just another step on her ladder to success? Kennedy's investigator uncovered a significant piece of evidence, a contract Precious had drawn up with a former lover, outlining financial support she expected in exchange for her companionship. Armed with this damning information, Kennedy planned his move. He anonymously sent the documents to a major news outlet, ensuring the story would spread like wildfire. The exposé hit the headlines, painting Precious as a manipulative opportunist who preyed on wealthy men. Overnight, she became a pariah. Richard was blindsided by the revelation, struggling to reconcile the woman he loved with the calculated figure described in the article. Precious, desperate to defend herself, accused Kennedy of orchestrating the smear campaign, but the damage was done. Richard confronted Kennedy for his role in the scandal. "How could you do this to her?" he demanded, his voice heavy with anger. Kennedy, unfazed, replied coldly, "I only exposed the truth. You chose her over me, Dad. This is what you deserve." Their argument escalated, with years of unresolved tension bubbling to the surface. Kennedy accused Richard of being a selfish father who prioritized his desires over his family, while Richard accused Kennedy of being spiteful and immature. The confrontation ended with Kennedy storming out, vowing never to speak to Richard again. For Richard, the fallout was devastating. He realized he had lost more than just his son, he had lost the respect of his family and peers. The choices he had made for love now seemed like monumental mistakes. Precious's world came crashing down. Invitations to exclusive events dried up, her social media following plummeted, and whispers of her manipulative past followed her everywhere. Richard, though initially supportive, began to distance himself, consumed by his own guilt and doubt. For the first time, Precious felt the consequences of her actions catching up with her. She tried to reach out to Kennedy, hoping for some form of reconciliation, but he refused to respond. She even considered leaving Richard, but the thought of starting over with nothing terrified her. Precious had always been a survivor, but this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Kennedy started to rebuild his life, focusing on his career and cutting ties with anyone associated with his father and Precious. He found solace in a new circle of friends who encouraged him to let go of the past and embrace new opportunities. Slowly, he began to heal, though the scars of betrayal lingered. One evening, Kennedy met a woman named Elaine at a networking event. She was intelligent, kind, and refreshingly genuine. Unlike Precious, Elaine had no interest in wealth or status, valuing authenticity above all else. For the first time, Kennedy felt hope for a future untainted by the pain of his past. Richard's relationship with Precious deteriorated as the weight of public scrutiny and personal doubt crushed whatever bond they once shared. He found himself reminiscing about simpler times when his focus had been on raising Kennedy and building his legacy. The guilt of losing his son for a fleeting romance haunted him. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Richard tried to reach out to Kennedy. He left a voicemail, his voice heavy with regret. "I know I've made mistakes," he said. "But you're my son, and I miss you. Please, let's talk." Kennedy listened to the message but couldn't bring himself to respond. Forgiveness felt too far away. Precious, now living in the shadow of her former life, made one final attempt to salvage her relationship with Richard. She planned a grand dinner, hoping to remind him of the love they once shared. But Richard, drained and disillusioned, saw through her facade. "This isn't working," he said quietly, pushing his plate aside. "I can't keep pretending." Precious broke down, pleading with him to reconsider, but Richard's mind was made up. He ended their relationship that night, leaving Precious to face the harsh reality of her choices. For the first time, she was truly alone. As months passed, Kennedy began to reflect on the events that had shaped his life. He realized that holding onto anger was only hurting himself. With Elaine's support, he decided to meet with Richard. The meeting was tense but honest, with both men airing their grievances and acknowledging their faults. While the wounds between them were far from healed, the conversation marked the beginning of a tentative reconciliation. Kennedy made it clear that he couldn't forget what had happened, but he was willing to take small steps toward mending their relationship. For Richard, it was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild what he had almost destroyed. Precious found herself in a dingy apartment far from the glamorous life she once knew. The once sought-after socialite was now a recluse, living off what little savings she had left. The betrayal of both Richard and Kennedy haunted her, but she refused to see herself as the villain. Precious believed she was a victim of circumstances, clinging to the hope that she could somehow reclaim her place in the world. One day, she received a call from a tabloid journalist offering to pay for an exclusive interview about her relationships with both Richard and Kennedy. Desperate for money, Precious agreed. She painted herself as misunderstood, claiming she had been swept away by love and manipulated by powerful men. The story reignited public interest, but instead of gaining sympathy, it further solidified her reputation as a cunning opportunist. Precious's attempt to rewrite her narrative backfired, pushing her further into obscurity. Kennedy's relationship with Elaine blossomed into something he had never experienced before: true partnership. Elaine's grounded perspective and unwavering support helped Kennedy rebuild his confidence. She encouraged him to pursue a passion project he had long neglected, starting a nonprofit organization to help underprivileged youth access education. As Kennedy poured his energy into his new venture, he began to feel a sense of fulfillment that had been missing for years. Elaine became his rock, and their love deepened with each passing day. Though Kennedy still bore the scars of his past, Elaine's presence reminded him that he was capable of moving forward. For the first time, he felt like he was truly leaving the shadows of Precious and Richard behind. Richard's life began unraveling after his breakup with Precious. His business faced declining profits due to scandals surrounding his personal life, and shareholders started questioning his leadership. For the first time in decades, Richard felt powerless. The empire he had built was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't stop it. Alone in his sprawling mansion, Richard began to reflect on the choices that had brought him to this point. He thought of Kennedy, the son he had betrayed, and the life they had shared before Precious entered the picture. Richard realized that his relentless pursuit of power and wealth had cost him the one thing money couldn't buy: genuine relationships. Precious, now struggling to make ends meet, crossed paths with Kennedy at a charity gala he was hosting. She had managed to secure an invite through a mutual acquaintance, hoping to network her way back into society. Seeing Kennedy on stage, confident and thriving, filled her with a mix of envy and regret. After the event, she approached him cautiously, unsure of how he would react. "Kennedy," she began softly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Kennedy stared at her, a wave of old emotions threatening to surface. But instead of anger, he felt pity. "I've moved on, Precious," he said firmly. "I hope you find peace." Precious realized in that moment that the man she had once manipulated was no longer the same. Kennedy had grown stronger, while she remained trapped in her cycle of self-destruction. Desperate to repair his relationship with Kennedy, Richard invited him to lunch at a quiet cafe. Kennedy hesitated but eventually agreed, curious to see what his father had to say. When they met, Richard looked older, his once commanding presence diminished. "I know I've made terrible mistakes," Richard admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Kennedy listened silently, his emotions a mixture of resentment and hope. "You hurt me more than anyone else ever could," he said, his tone steady. "But I'm willing to try, on my terms." The conversation ended with a tentative handshake, marking the beginning of a fragile truce between father and son. Refusing to give up, Precious devised a plan to rebuild her status. She started dating a wealthy entrepreneur, carefully crafting the image of a reformed woman seeking redemption. Her charm and wit helped her regain some credibility, but behind the scenes, she remained as calculating as ever. Her new partner, however, was not as naive as she thought. He began to suspect her intentions, quietly investigating her past. When he uncovered her history with Richard and Kennedy, he confronted her in private. Furious, he cut all ties, leaving Precious humiliated and without options once again. Kennedy's nonprofit gained national attention, earning him praise for his dedication to helping others. He was invited to speak at major events and even received awards for his contributions to society. For Kennedy, the success was bittersweet. While he was proud of his accomplishments, he often wondered what his relationship with Richard could have been like had things turned out differently. Elaine, ever supportive, reminded him to focus on the present. "You've built something incredible," she told him one evening. "Don't let the past overshadow your future." Her words resonated with Kennedy, pushing him to fully embrace the life he had worked so hard to create. Richard, inspired by Kennedy's work, decided to invest in charitable causes as a way to redeem himself. He donated millions to education initiatives and even partnered with Kennedy's organization on a few projects. Though their interactions were professional, they marked a significant step toward rebuilding their bond. The media began to take notice of Richard's transformation, portraying him as a man seeking atonement for his past mistakes. While Richard cared little for public opinion, he hoped his actions would show Kennedy that he was genuinely trying to change. Precious's latest schemes had left her with few allies and even fewer resources. She reached out to Richard, hoping to rekindle their relationship, but he refused to entertain her advances. "We've both made mistakes, Precious," he said coldly. "But I've learned from mine. It's time you did the same." Faced with rejection from both Richard and Kennedy, Precious finally acknowledged the depth of her downfall. She retreated from public life, leaving behind the world of wealth and privilege she had once fought so hard to be part of. For Precious, it was the end of a long, lonely road. Kennedy and Richard stood side by side at a charity event, their relationship still fragile but showing signs of growth. As they addressed the crowd together, Kennedy felt a sense of closure. While he knew he could never fully forgive his father, he realized that holding onto anger would only keep him chained to the past. After the event, Kennedy and Elaine shared a quiet moment together. "You've come so far," she said, squeezing his hand. Kennedy smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. Though the scars of betrayal would always remain, Kennedy was finally ready to embrace the future, a future shaped not by pain, but by hope and resilience. Months after disappearing from the public eye, Precious reappeared in a modest town far from the bustling city. She had taken on a quiet life, working as a receptionist at a small hotel. The glamour and wealth she once coveted were gone, replaced by the stark reality of her choices. Precious spent her days reflecting on the mistakes she had made, wondering if redemption was ever possible. One evening, she stumbled across a local news broadcast highlighting Kennedy's nonprofit work. Seeing him on screen, happy, accomplished, and surrounded by people who respected him, brought tears to her eyes. For the first time, she felt genuine remorse. The allure of wealth and power had blinded her to what truly mattered. But was it too late for her to change? Richard's relentless efforts to rebuild his life and relationship with Kennedy came to a sudden halt when he suffered a minor heart attack. The incident was a wake-up call for both father and son. Kennedy rushed to the hospital upon hearing the news, his anger momentarily replaced by concern. Seeing his father weak and vulnerable stirred a mix of emotions, pain, love, and lingering resentment. Richard, lying in his hospital bed, took the opportunity to apologize once again. "I know I've failed you, Kennedy," he said, his voice trembling. "But I hope you'll find it in your heart to let me make amends." Kennedy nodded but said little. While the gesture was meaningful, forgiveness still felt like a distant goal. Elaine, sensing that Kennedy was still grappling with unresolved emotions, suggested a bold idea. "What if you and your dad worked on a project together? Something that could bring you closer," she proposed one evening. Kennedy hesitated, unsure if such a collaboration could ever work. After much thought, Kennedy approached Richard with the idea of launching a scholarship fund in memory of Kennedy's late mother. To Kennedy's surprise, Richard eagerly agreed. The project became a shared mission, allowing them to connect over a cause that honored their family's legacy. While their relationship was far from perfect, the shared effort began to mend the rift between them. Precious, yearning for closure, wrote letters to both Richard and Kennedy. In her letters, she apologized for the pain she had caused, admitting her faults and explaining the insecurities that had driven her actions. She did not ask for forgiveness but hoped her words would provide some understanding. Kennedy received his letter but chose not to respond. For him, acknowledging Precious's remorse was enough. He no longer needed her validation. Richard, on the other hand, found himself deeply moved by her words. He decided to visit her, not to rekindle their relationship, but to offer her a chance at peace. Richard and Precious met at a quiet cafe in the town where she now lived. She looked different, worn, humbled, and far from the radiant woman who had once captivated him. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her eyes filled with regret. Richard listened as she poured her heart out, detailing the emptiness she had felt despite her glamorous lifestyle. "I don't blame you anymore," Richard said after a long silence. "We both made mistakes. But I hope you find happiness, Precious, even if it's not the kind you once chased." The conversation ended on a bittersweet note, leaving Precious with a glimmer of hope for a better future. The scholarship fund, named after Kennedy's mother, launched with great success. The inaugural event brought together donors, educators, and students, all eager to support the cause. Richard and Kennedy stood side by side on stage, presenting the first round of scholarships to deserving students. As they shook hands with the recipients, Kennedy felt a sense of pride, not just for the initiative, but for the progress he and his father had made. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For the first time, he saw a version of his father that he could respect, a man who was trying, however imperfectly, to make things right. Elaine, who had been Kennedy's unwavering support system, had a surprise of her own. One evening, she revealed that she was pregnant. Kennedy was overwhelmed with joy and a touch of fear. "I want to be the kind of father mine wasn't," he confessed. Elaine reassured him, reminding him of the growth he had already shown. The news brought Kennedy and Richard closer. Richard offered advice and shared stories of Kennedy's childhood, moments of warmth that hinted at the bond they were slowly rebuilding. The prospect of a new life brought healing to their fractured relationship, symbolizing a fresh start for their family. Inspired by her conversation with Richard, Precious began volunteering at a local community center, teaching life skills to underprivileged women. Slowly, she rebuilt her life, focusing on giving rather than taking. While she remained estranged from her old life, she found fulfillment in helping others avoid the mistakes she had made. One day, she came across an article about Kennedy's scholarship fund. Seeing the positive impact he was making inspired her to reach out, not to reconnect, but to donate anonymously to the fund. It was her way of contributing to something meaningful, even from the sidelines. As Elaine's due date approached, Kennedy invited Richard to a family dinner. It was the first time in years that they sat together as a family, sharing stories and laughter. Though the memories of their past still lingered, the evening was a testament to the healing they had achieved. Richard, holding Elaine's hand, expressed his gratitude. "Thank you for bringing us back together," he said. Kennedy, though hesitant, nodded in agreement. While the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, they had found a way to move forward, united by love and a shared commitment to family. On a crisp autumn morning, Elaine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Kennedy held his son in his arms, overwhelmed by a love he had never known. Richard, standing beside him, smiled through tears. "You're going to be a great father," he said, his voice filled with pride. The birth of Kennedy's son marked the beginning of a new chapter for their family. It was a chapter built on forgiveness, growth, and the understanding that even the deepest wounds could heal with time. Though their journey had been fraught with pain, it had led them to a place of hope, where love and resilience triumphed over betrayal. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this amazing story? Please leave a like and subscribe for more interesting stories.